So in this video, I want to talk about why the best thing that could possibly happen to Russia is that it loses the war. And I know if you're pro-Ukrainian, you're already thinking, of course, that is an optimal solution, but it's actually the best thing for Russia as well. Timothy Snyder did this lecture on the pearl of slowness, and he talked about other things through his lecture. And then in the Q&A, he actually somebody raised this point, and he said, essentially, what Russia needs most in order to join like the civilized international European community is to lose. I'm going to let him talk in just a moment, but it reminded me of this book that was turned into a movie a number of years ago, The Mouse That Roared. Now, this is an imperfect analogy. In The Mouse That Roared, what happened was this really tiny little country attacks the United States on the thinking that if they attack, they'll be beaten and then the US will rebuild. That's an oversimplification, and then they accidentally won. I'm not suggesting that Russia's winning. I'm not suggesting that it's anything else like this. But what Russia really needs is to be beaten and then to be revived, somewhat like what happened to Japan in World War II, somewhat like what happened to Germany in World War II. But the only path forward for Russia really to join the family of nations is to actually be beaten, lose its imperial warlikeness, and to come back into the fold in that way. There's no other way. If they win, it's going to be even worse. Now they're emboldened to do worse. So let's hear what Timothy Snyder had to say here when he's asked this question.
Hi, thank you very much to you and to the FPA for this invaluable conversation. I wanted to know, what would a defeated Russia look like, both domestically and in its role as a global power?
I mean, these things are impossible to predict, but broadly speaking, defeat is a very good thing to happen to you as an imperial power. The it's the whole history of the happy, safe Europe that one has is a result of Europeans losing imperial wars. That's
That's
the
an interesting perspective, isn't it? So defeat is actually a good thing to be happening to you as an imperial power because once you've been defeated, then something changes.
main thing. I mean, the precondition of the European Union is, you'll notice if you follow the history, the whole sequence is you lose an imperial war. The Germans lost an imperial war for Ukraine, incidentally, or maybe not so incidentally, in 1945. The French lose in Southeast Asia and Algeria. The Dutch lose in Indonesia. The Spanish and the Portuguese then lose in Africa. You have to lose an imperial war. Like that's insofar as there's an iron law of European history, you have to lose your imperial war in order to get to that position where you say, oh, we're a European country and now we're going to be all peaceful, right? The whole European, the whole European story, which is 100% wrong, is we're very peaceful, unlike the Americans, because we don't like to fight wars. But the true story is that the Europeans did not learn from 1945 not to fight wars. That never happened. That's 100% mythical. After 1945, Europeans kept fighting wars until they lost them. I mean, right after the Second World War, the Dutch went after Indonesia. I mean, there was no, they did what they were going to do, which was to maintain themselves as empires. The decolonization happened because they lost wars. It wasn't some kind of objective process. They lost.
And Russia still has an empire mentality, and they're going after Ukraine to put the jewel in their empire. And if that happens, they're emboldened. But if they lose that, maybe what he's talking about will happen, where they will, yeah, maybe we're just going to play nice instead, and that'll shift.
Wars. And I say this just to set up Russia because I think it's really important not to think, oh, like Russia is so special and mystical and something like it's an empire. Empires eventually overreach and they lose wars. That's a
Mhm.
200-year historical pattern. Russia fits into it. I would like to think more or less normally. It will be awkward when they lose a war, but the best chance, and I believe the only chance, to have something like a normal Russia is for Russia to lose this war. And this is one of the things which I find very frustrating that, yeah, Russia has chosen to fight this illegal war of aggression. It's chosen to do this, but that doesn't mean that we have to think, well, the outcome must necessarily be worse if they lose. I mean, you gotta lose those wars. The wars that you, like the genocidal wars, those are the ones you should lose. You got to lose.
Yeah, and very much on the other side of the equation is like, oh, we don't want Russia to lose. We want strong Russia. We want them to stay together. We want okay, but if they lose, then they can come to terms with what they've done. Then they can make reparations. Then they can discard some of the ugliness in their culture, in their ideology, that they won't let it go without having lost.
Those wars. You can't, because if you win them, then you think this is the way the world works. Not just for you, but you're educating the entire world that this is the way the
Hmm.
world works, right? That's what I don't know how clearly I got it across, but this is what I meant when I said Ukraine was defending the EU model. Because insofar as an imperial power it loses or seems to be losing a war, then something like the EU makes sense. But the Russian foreign ministry, whatever this means, is explicitly committed to the idea that the EU is an artificial temporary creation, that all that really matters is empire, and that it's right, good, and normal for them to be returning us all to a world of empire. And when I say that, by the way,
And so it's not about neo-Nazis. It's not about whatever the other pretexts are. It's not about NATO moving closer. It's not any of those things. It's about the Russian mentality of empire is still there. And until they lose it, until they lose the war, they keep that mentality and the threat persists.
I'm not saying that the Russians are the only ones who engage in imperialist behavior, just to be clear. So in general, I think empires have to lose, and I think we have to not be so incredibly sensitive to the things that are going to happen in Russia. This is my second point. When the regime changes in Russia, it's going to look really weird to a lot of people. Um, but it's not going to look weird inside Russia. So like Prigozhin, I mean things that we forget, but like Prigozhin marching on Moscow, it's going to look something like that. And like when Prigozhin marches on Moscow and like he lands in a city and everybody welcomes him and like then goes to the store and buys stuff like nothing happened. It's going to be like that. It's going to be uncanny. It's going to look weird from the outside, but it's going to feel normal to Russians. And this is one of the things I think is very important that like both with respect to Ukraine and with respect to Russia, we have to accept that these people have their own agency and sometimes their own way of doing things. And their own way of doing things may seem odd to us. And in fact, I can guarantee that like the next regime change in Russia, it's going to be odd. Like it's going to be odd. There's going to be something that seems strange about it, but that doesn't mean that it isn't going to work in some kind of way which Russians themselves are able to accept. And then the third point, so there's the empire point, there's the let's not try. So this is a very important point for Americans too, because one of the ways we express, I think, our conceit is the notion that, well, something that we could do might make Russia normal, which is like the great fantasy of the 1990s, right? Like that there's something we, and there are things we could have done better in the 90s and things we could have done better since, but our policy has generally been to leap over Ukraine and then to imagine that there's some way that we can get Russia to look like we want Russia to look. But there,
And to his point about the 90s, we had high hopes for Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union that they would come into the family of nations and just play nice and trade and buy and sell and just be normal, not have this empire view. Well, but they have to lose that empire kind of mentality that they have.
there isn't a moment where that's ever worked. There isn't a moment since 1991 where we have been able to reach in and say, okay, well, you know, Yeltsin, don't bomb that parliament, or Putin, don't, destroy that Chechnya. There isn't a moment where we've done that. And I think that's a lesson that we should learn, that whether Russia invaded Ukraine was not up to us, and what happened in the aftermath also not up to us, not just in a moral sense, but also in a practical sense. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to affect it very much. And so if we can't affect it very much, it shouldn't be the thing that is guiding, or because you shouldn't guide yourself into a place where you know you're going to be impotent. And so if we design our policy around like trying to be sure that what happens in Russia is going to be a normal democratic regime change or something, you're then aiming for a place which you're never going to reach because it doesn't really exist. And so like and that's like we want Eastern Europe to be, I'm simplifying a little bit, but we want Eastern Europe to be Russia, and then we want Russia to be its leader, and then we want to then we want to think, okay, we can do something about that. Whereas I think 30 years have shown that the most effective US policy to Russia is an effective US policy to Ukraine. That
Yep.
is the one way that we've actually been able to do something is by aiming for a smaller country, which is more sympathetic to us, which where things have an indirect effect on Russia. So if we want a democratic Russia, then we have to have a democratic Ukraine. I mean, I'm not saying it will definitely be one in Russia if there's a democratic Ukraine, but if autocratic Russia destroys democratic Ukraine, there is not going to be a democratic Russia anytime soon. There has to, and this is one of the reasons why Putin finds, going back to Noel's very first question, one of the reasons why Russia finds Ukraine so irritating, or Putin does, is that it is a more or less functioning rule of law, civil society, democratic type thing. And that sort of thing is inimical to his way of guarding power. Then the third thing I'm just going to point out that Russia.
Now, before he goes to that third point, and this is really important, Ukraine wants to be democratic. Ukraine aspires to be democratic. They're moving headlong to become part of the European Union. And so to have that contrast right on Russia's border is significant to Putin. And I think that's more of a reason than anything about neo-Nazis or anything else.
Russia, I've said this before, but Russia's lost a lot of wars. Like I assume that we're all pretty calm about Russia's defeat in 1856 and the Crimean War, right? We've all come to terms with that, right? We've all come to terms with Russia losing to Japan 1905. That was okay, right? We're fine with that. Soviet Union lost to Afghanistan in 1979. I doubt that keeps anybody up at night, right? Big powers lose wars, it happens, and then they have to deal with it. But in all of those cases, I'm also going to point out, those three cases anyway, Afghanistan, Crimea, Russo-Japanese War, it led to periods of reform in all three cases.
Right.
In all three cases, it opened up possibilities which wouldn't have been there otherwise.
And that's what's going to happen. Period of reform if Russia loses the war. If Russia wins the war, no reform, more hostility, more potential aggression for the rest of the world. Not just for Russia, but for others who are following that example. Okay, tell me what you thought about that. I thought his analysis was spot on. Put your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine and the world.